What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Sponsored by peer-run support communities Freedom Center, The Icarus Project, and Portland Hearing Voices. Madness Radio can be heard on FM stations on the Pacifica Radio Network and is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio. Thanks for joining us today on Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today, my guest is Dr. Raymond Tallis. Dr. Tallis is a clinical neuroscientist and physician of gerontology. He was named by The Economist magazine as one of the world's top living polymaths and was also named by Prospect magazine as one of Britain's top 100 intellectuals. He's a poet, a novelist, and a short story writer, and he's also the author of recent books Michelangelo's Finger and The Kingdom of Infinite Space, and most recently, The Defense of Wonder. He's also the author of Aping Mankind, Neuromania, Darwinitis, and The Misrepresentation of Humanity. And we're going to be speaking with Dr. Tallis about biological reductionism. So welcome to Madness Radio, Ray Tallis.
Hello there.
I want to really thank you for coming on the show. I just recently discovered your work, and I was saying before, I'm very, very impressed because you come from the background of a neuroscientist and also practicing a physician who works with dementia patients and geriatrics. And so you're very, very familiar with the clinical side of things, but you're also really involved with theory and philosophy, and especially recently critiquing this biological reductionism that is so rampant in society, and it reduces the mind with all of its complexities, all of its mysteries, and all of its wonder and amazement into just a simple machine that is explained by brain science. And of course, that's something that we talk about and critique quite a bit, the biological model of the mind and biological reductionism in psychiatry. So I'm very happy to have you on the show. Now, Ray, how did you get started and interested in this topic? How did you go from being a clinical neuroscientist and physician to getting interested in theory and critiquing biological reductionism?
Well, my interest in medicine and my interest in philosophy have equal antiquity. I mean, I was interested in philosophy from early teens, and I knew I wanted to be a doctor in my early teens. So the two have run in parallel, really. And I can remember my poor tutor at Oxford when I was a medical student there, having to listen to my philosophical critique of some aspects of the neurophysiology that we learned at Oxford. He was an extremely patient and a courteous man. So it is, in a sense, the two strands of my interests have developed in parallel, and as I say, have equal antiquity.
So even from the beginning of your studies, you were not agreeing with a lot of what you were being taught around neurophysiology as explaining experiences in the mind.
Absolutely right. The reason I think I didn't get a first-class honours degree at Oxford, I'm sure there were many other reasons, was that I completely fouled up a question on memory and the neurophysiology of memory. And my own feeling was you couldn't actually have a neurophysiology of memory, and that was my answer, which of course would be scored very low in a neurophysiology department, and I think that was thankfully without trace when I was hoping to get a first. So I've been sort of involved in this quarrel for a very long time.
And I want to say it's also very significant, Ray, that your interests are so wide-ranging. I mean, you're a poet, you're a novelist, and you were described as one of the world's top living polymaths, which means someone who has expertise and interest as an intellectual in many, many different fields. Before we get into the work that you've been doing on biological reductionism, just give us a sense of that sort of scope of your intellectual endeavors, because it's quite impressive.
Well, I suppose that there's two dimensions to it. One is very positive and the other is somewhat negative. The positive dimension is I have an overwhelming sense of the wonder and complexity of the world, and I do so from the standpoint of an atheist humanist. But that's a sort of positive side, as a result of which I'm very hostile to those who try and reduce us, whether they reduce us biologically, as I'm sure we will talk about in due course, or whether they reduce us as the theorists, people like Lacan and Derrida, I guess whom your listeners may not have heard of, but they were extremely popular at one stage, who tried to reduce humanity to sets of signs and to deny our individual agency and so on. So there's been a positive drive, a sense of joy of the complexity of the world and in particular of human beings, and a considerable crossness about the way academics in various fields have tried to reduce us with their simplifying frameworks.
And have you always been a poet and a creative writer?
Yes, although poetry sort of has been episodic. I mean, when our children were very young, it was actually quite difficult to hold a whole treatise or a novel in your head, so I used to write poems while I was rocking the pram, and you could keep the whole lot in your head. So I would express my feelings about the world through poetry because they were mind portable. And so I was much more likely to be a poet in the early 1980s when our kids were small than I am now when I've got the leisure to be able to write books at length uninterrupted.
Well, let's talk about this question of biological reductionism, and that's really the thesis of your book, Aping Mankind, Neuromania, Darwinitis, and the Misrepresentation of Humanity. Tell us about that.
Well, you're absolutely right. Its central target is not biology. Biology is one of the great achievements of the human intellect, but biologism, the idea that we can be understood as organisms, that people are essentially organisms. And biologism has two strands, as illustrated in the title of the book. One is neuromania, and that is the idea that we are our brains, that our consciousness is identical with neural activity, and you can understand our behavior by looking at our brains. If you really want to understand human beings and what motivates them and so on and so forth, you peer into the intracranial darkness using techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging or brain scans. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is Darwinitis. Now, Darwinism is fine. Darwin's theory of evolution is one of the most, probably the greatest idea anybody's ever had. But Darwinitis is something quite different. Darwinism says that, explains the processes by which the organism, Homo sapiens, came into being. Darwinitis says those same processes explain what people are. And actually, I don't think that's the case. I think people are not identical with organisms. And I say that not because I have a religious agenda or because I believe in something, an immaterial soul, but because I look at what's in front of my nose, which is that people are entirely different from all other forms of living matter.
Now, this is why I have you on the show, is because these two approaches that we can understand the mind by taking a picture of the brain using a magnetic resonance image, or that we can take a look at theories of brain chemistry and neurons, and that we can explain what human experience is about. That's become almost common sense. I mean, it's a widespread assumption in all of approaches to psychology and in popular culture. And also there's this idea of evolutionary psychology, the idea of Darwinitis that you're calling it, that if we just understand how primitive human beings evolved into maximizing our fitness, that we are seeking other people in order to carry on the reproduction of our genes in this survival of the fittest framework, that has become so ubiquitous, so widespread in the culture that it's not ever critiqued. And then you're going directly against that. You're saying actually there's a fundamental flaw in both of those perspectives, this idea of biological reductionism.
I think, and you put your finger on it, it's become so ubiquitous that it almost seems like common sense to many people. And to oppose it seems like opposing the blindingly obvious. But when we look a little bit closer at the claims of people who, as it were, advance neuromania, or we look at evolutionary psychologists, they disintegrate. One of the most talked about areas of aspects of neuromania has been social neuroscience. This is the use of neuroscience to explain the nature of love, of beauty, of wisdom, to say exactly what religious beliefs are, to explain or to find new ways in which we can determine whether people have criminal responsibility for their actions and so on and so forth. This has become very widespread indeed, but if you look more closely, you can see it disintegrates.
What are some examples of that? I'm thinking, for example, the search for the God area of the brain, or the idea that people are motivated to love because of the release of certain kinds of chemistries, of chemicals in the brain that give us good feelings, and therefore this explains why we fall in love.
Those are two terrific examples. First of all, the notion that we can explain religious belief in terms of neural activity, and that there has been a God spot implanted in our brains by evolution, because religion apparently is very good for making sure we get on together well. History actually doesn't support that, but never mind. But there are those who believe there is a God spot in the brain, and one of the bases for that is discovering that certain people who have epilepsy sometimes have experiences that appear to have a religious dimension to them. Well, I have to tell you, I did epilepsy clinics for 20 years, and I never had a patient whose seizures resulted in a religious conversion. This is a very good example of the kind of reductionism that one sees in Neuromania, because religious beliefs are not just about simple, isolated experiences, bursts of feeling. They're about doctrines and creeds. They're about commitments to ethical codes. They're about observances and so on and so forth. Most of those who believe that you can neuralize religion actually miss the complexity and the profundity of religion. You wouldn't get a cathedral out of a whole pile of brains spiking off, in particular places. And although I'm an atheist, I feel quite protective towards God when he's reduced by neurotheologians to spiking of certain areas in the brain. So that's one very good example that you've pointed to of the reductive nature or the reductive consequences of neuromania.
But what would you make of the fact that there is this correlation that some magnetic resonance images, brain scans, have claimed to make between religious experiences and certain parts of the brain so-called lighting up? What do you make of that correlation that's so often claimed between brain activity and conscious experience?
Well, first of all, there's a philosophical point that correlation is not causation, even less is it identity. So just because when somebody's having a moment of religious experience that a particular part of the brain lights up, doesn't mean to say their religious experience is their brain lighting up. But of course, religious experiences are things that if we have an experience, we ourselves interpret it. We interpret it in the light of our culture. If I had a most wonderful feeling, I'd be much more inclined, if I moved in a particular religious setting, to attribute it to an experience of God than I would if I was in a non-religious culture. So in other words, what happens, the sort of feelings that people may have aren't sufficient to generate religious beliefs. Somehow the interpretation has to come from without. And that without is the community of minds to which we belong, which the standalone brain gives us an entrance ticket to, but doesn't encompass. Does that make sense?
So there's still this gap between the physiological experience and then what the mind makes of it. And that is called the hard question in consciousness studies. How does what we call awareness or consciousness arise supposedly from this foundation of brain activity? And that has never been explained by any of the neuroscience theories.
You're quite right. And the hard question goes deeper than these higher level things like religion. It goes right down to straightforward things like the fact that I can experience your voice as a sound, that there's, the taste of wine, the feeling of warmth on one's hands. That itself is quite different from any neural activity. So that's the hard question. And quite a lot of those philosophers who want to believe that neuroscience explains these fundamental ground floor contents of consciousness, they actually sort of feel very uncomfortable about precisely those contents of consciousness. They deny the existence of what philosophers would call qualia. They say, qualia, they're just folk psychological constructs. But actually, you and I both know that the feeling that we have when we're drinking a glass of wine or looking at the sun is hardly a folk psychological construct.
So you're identifying there are all these logical fallacies that are at the basis of a lot of our neuroscience explanations for human consciousness and the mind.
There are, and some of them are quite subtle fallacies. For example, John Searle, who's a pretty good philosopher, says the relationship between neural activity and consciousness is like the relationship between molecules of H2O and water. Now, molecules of H2O aren't shiny and slippery, but water is shiny and slippery. But water is nothing more than molecules of H2O. So that's the relationship we have. That illustrates the relationship between neural activity and conscious experience. The trouble is that that kind of analogy relies on importing consciousness from the outside. Of course, water looked at one level is molecules, and looked at or experienced at another level is all shiny and slippery. But note, looked at. In other words, the two levels at which water is on the one hand H2O, and on the other hand shiny and slippery, rely on consciousness. So you can't use this as a model for the relationship between neural activity and consciousness.
You quoted the writer Matt Crawford as saying that brain scans are, quote, the fast-acting solvent of critical faculties, unquote.
It's such a lovely quote, isn't it? I really wish I'd thought of that myself. Anyway, I'm pleased to disseminate that marvelous statement. And you can see the kind of critical, I'll come back again, and the way he was referring to experiments in so-called social neuroscience, where using magnetic resonance imaging and other brain scanning techniques, people think they can identify the nature of love. And I want to give you an example of an experiment which is so crude, I'm sure it'll make your listeners fall out laughing. This is an experiment carried out by Semir Zeki and his colleagues. They wanted to know what the nature of love was. So what they did was they showed some subjects pictures of people they were in love with, and they showed the subjects pictures of people who were just acquaintances. And then they subtracted the brain activity in the second case from the brain activity in the first case. And what remained counted as romantic love. Well, those of us who are not Martians or neuromaniacs know that love doesn't consist of a simple response to a stimulus. It consists of many, many things, including not being in love at that moment, worrying about what the loved one is thinking, imagining relationships and meetings, and, extraordinarily complicated, as well as all the sort of basic lust and awe and joy and so on. The idea you can reduce love, romantic love, to the response to a stimulus is exactly the kind of reductionism that biologism, and in particular neuromania, specializes in.
What are some of the other claims that neuromania makes that seem very attractive and then might almost seem like common sense until you actually start scrutinizing them?
Well, there are the claims that neuroscience can help us to replace the untidy judicial processes that we have at the moment in determining criminal responsibility with a biological justice. And how can you determine whether somebody can be held responsible for an action that they did? Well, you put their head in a brain scan, and you can look at the activity in the frontal lobe, which controls your behavior and is pro-social, and you can look at the activity in the amygdaloid body, which is impulsive and can sometimes be antisocial. And if a person has too much activity in the amygdaloid body and not enough activity in the frontal lobe, they cannot be held responsible for whatever crime they did.
So if you just identify neurologically, this is an impulse part of the brain that's driving this behavior, then somehow the person is off the hook because their brain made them do it in a sense.
Exactly. My brain made me do it, the brain's in the dock, and please, judge my brain. But of course, trying to decide what are normative data for the balance between the amygdaloid body and the frontal lobes, requires actually referring to all the usual methods we use for determining criminal responsibility. So there have been studies on psychopaths and looking at the balance between their frontal lobes and their amygdaloid bodies, seeing whether it's different from that of other people. First of all, the differences aren't great. Secondly, those differences may be the result not of any psychopathic tendency, but of the life that people have lived. And thirdly, you have to arrive at the decision that someone's a psychopath, not using brain scans at all, but by using the normal behavioral and historical and interview techniques that we would use before. So the brain scan brings nothing new to the party.
All those diagnostic criteria we talk about on Madness Radio, of course, being very culturally constructed. What might be considered psychopathic behavior in one culture might be considered like great leadership in another culture, for example.
You're absolutely right, and that's precisely what I mentioned. You mentioned that the cultural sensitivity, that's precisely what's missing. But you can't, by peering into the intracranial darkness of a standalone brain, make any judgment as the appropriateness of someone's behavior, because, exactly as you said, what is regarded as appropriate or good or desirable behavior in one culture may be regarded as inappropriate, bad, and undesirable in another culture.
I was reading an anthropological account recently of a tribal society where paranoia is actually quite normal. Everyone spends all their time worrying about other clans and other groups and other families trying to steal from them or influence them magically, and this is just part of the whole cultural framework. That would be normal in that culture, whereas in our culture it would be considered paranoid.
Indeed, the people are getting at you may actually be quite an adaptive thought if people are likely to be getting at you.
Yeah, it depends on the context and the culture, and something that we talk about quite a bit is the early days of psychiatric diagnosis. I mean, you mentioned dementia, and you mentioned your work in geriatric medicine, working with brains, and as a clinical neuroscientist. I mean, clearly there's some relationship between the health and the well-being of the brain and someone's health and well-being as a person. There's a clear relationship. But what happened, I think, early in the diagnostic development of the clinical categories by Emil Kraepelin and the early psychologists and psychiatrists was that they mixed in people that we would now know to have organic brain problems with those that would not actually have anything that would show up under any kind of physical scrutiny of their brains. So, for example, you recognize that there is a role, obviously, in consciousness and affecting consciousness of something like dementia, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all experiences of human distress or human difference can be reduced to some kind of malfunction in the brain we can't actually see if we look at it.
Absolutely. I mean, there are certain obvious principles that in order for me to have the slightest tingle of sensation or the most exquisitely constructed sense of self, I have to have a brain in some kind of working order. If you chop my head off, my IQ falls, or bash me on the head, I lose consciousness. The brain is a necessary condition of what would be regarded as normal behavior or behavior that enables one to live happily and with others and so on and so forth. It isn't a sufficient condition. It isn't the whole story. And nor is it even when someone has a brain illness. Dementia clearly is an organic psychosis, as you were sort of alluding to. There is a clear correlation between cognitive impairment, behavioral, abnormal behavior, and all sorts of markers like the loss of cholinergic pathways in different parts of the brain and so on and so forth. So there's an organic psychosis where there's a clear correlation between the manifestations of this psychiatric illness and what you can see in the brain. But even then, still the person who has the illness is not entirely identified with brain activity with the illness. Different people have dementia in different ways. They find their own very tricky path through this awful experience in different ways. There never cease to be persons who are not simply identical with organisms. When it comes to conditions such as schizophrenia and depression, the relationship between brain disturbance and the experience of the person and the manifestation of the illness becomes even less clear-cut. And I think it's very important to appreciate that. Having said that, I mean, so medication and a biological understanding has an important contribution, very obvious in the case of dementia, a little more complex in the case of schizophrenia or depression, but it's not the whole story.
And I think especially when we put into the mix the whole placebo effect and the expectations and the way in which learning, and even someone who has something that's very clearly organic like dementia, there still is the role of their relationships, of their learning, of their context, of how they're treated. They're not simply a malfunctioning machine, which is, I think, a lot of the message of the neurological interpretations.
I agree with you entirely. The person with brain damage is still a person. If their brain is damaged as in dementia, they remain a person trying to negotiate a world. If that world is user-friendly, they will flourish more than if the world is hostile or treats them as aliens and so on.
One of the ways I've heard this explained, Ray, is that you can listen to Mozart on a radio, but if you want to understand Mozart, you don't start taking apart the parts of the radio and looking at all the different wiring and electrical components to explain what Mozart is about. That may be a necessary condition for listening to the music over the radio, but it's a very, very almost insignificant part of what really that music is about.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, in order to transmit Mozart over the radio, clearly his work has to be as it reduced to its spectral frequency, and that has to make things vibrate and electrical currents to flow and so on and so forth. But what happens at the other end when I receive it is something totally different.
Well, let's talk about the use of Darwin and evolutionary theory to explain human behavior, because that's the other aspect of your book, Aping Mankind, is critiquing that. Give us some examples of the way in which the biological reductionism works in the context of evolutionary explanations.
Yes. I mean, it's worthwhile saying, just to reiterate, that Darwin's theory is probably one of the greatest, best ideas anyone's ever had. Daniel Dennett said that. I disagree with Dennett on many things, but I agree with him on that. And the most extraordinary thing about Darwin's theory is that it has stood up against exposure to information and knowledge and technologies that he never even dreamed of. When he put forward his theory, there was no proper genetics, there was no notion of continental drift, there was no carbon dating. All of those things which have come since, and the fossil record was very incomplete, all those things have come since 1859, and yet his theory has been endlessly confirmed. So it is one of the most extraordinary theories. So there's nothing wrong with Darwinism. Organisms have been generated by the process of natural selection on spontaneous variation. Are human beings organisms in the way that chimpanzees are organisms? Mm-hmm. When you've described a chimpanzee as an organism, you've completed the story of a chimpanzee. When I've described you as an organism, I've hardly even begun, because we live not as organisms, but as people in communities of minds. And we have all sorts, we live not merely in a biosphere, but in a semiosphere, a sphere of signs. We live in institutions, we're affected by social facts. Every single biological given is transformed in human beings. Take so-called feeding. I mean, there's a difference between an animal feeding and our eating. Our eating is regulated by the calendar and the clock. It is very much a ritualistic, in many cases, exercise. We have a grammar of what food goes with what other food, and so on and so forth. We bring food from all the four quarters of the earth to eat. So our eating is totally different from an animal feeding. And I've focused on that, really, because people, when they try and say we're different from animals, tend to point out rather high-end things, such as symphonies and fretting over transfinite numbers and so on. But I think our differences from beasts are absolutely wall-to-wall. It applies to feeding, it applies to learning, it applies to defecation, it applies to our attitude to death, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me, in order to refute evolutionary psychology, you just have to look at what's in front of your nose. You have to look at the difference between an hour in a library and an hour in the jungle, or an hour in an operating theatre and an hour in the savannah. Total difference.
If you're just tuning in, this is Madness Radio, and we're speaking with Dr. Raymond Tallis. He's a clinical neuroscientist and physician of gerontology who was named by The Economist magazine as one of the world's top living polymaths. He's the author of Aping Mankind, Neuromania, Darwinitis, and the Misrepresentation of Humanity. And so that idea that we're not just part of nature, but we're actually part of the semiosphere. We're inside of a meaning-generated language, cultural experience that we cannot get out of. That's the essence of who we are. What are some examples of the way in which evolutionary explanations are used to explain human behavior? Because I think that it starts to drift into another misuse of Darwin, which was social Darwinism and the eugenics movement, which is essentially a way of explaining away very, very nasty hierarchies and human abuse in terms of, well, the stronger should be the ones who survive, the fitter are the ones who should be on top.
That's absolutely right. But of course, that's actually bad biology. As Franz de Waal has pointed out, many animals do actually cooperate. He's looked at the pro-social behavior in chimpanzees, and it isn't a question of the survival of the fittest and dog eat dog and so on, even in the animal kingdom. That particular notion that we will only get better and better by destroying the weaker amongst us has clearly had appalling consequences in the last century, and who knows, may come back again to haunt us. I mean, the one that amuses me most is the appeal to Darwinism to explain our economic behavior. You know, that we have a brain that was evolved in order to enable us to survive in the Pleistocene era. And in that era, you had to take everything at once. You couldn't wait. And that's why we always have unwise consumption, patterns of consumption. Because the amygdaloid body that says, I want it now, isn't sufficiently suppressed by the frontal lobes, which says, wait until you can afford it. Because the frontal lobe and the amygdaloid body, as it were, established their relationship back in the Pleistocene era. And I do find it very amusing that people explain the credit crunch, for example, in terms of the biology of the brain as it was defined or determined or shaped in the Pleistocene era. Of course, the reason these subprime mortgages arose was because of a change in the regulations regarding mortgages.
Yeah, once you start being on the lookout for evolutionary explanations for human experience and human behavior, it's incredible how many otherwise intelligent people seem to be embracing very, very crude, reductionist, simplistic explanations for complicated behavior. It's like the idea that, you know, if you can look at it under a magnetic resonance image, that somehow that explains the richness and the complexity of the human mind. It's really very, very widespread, these understandings. And Ray, what do you think is the motivation? Why is it that there's been so much of an enthusiasm for this biological reductionism? What are your thoughts about that?
I think there are three main reasons. One is neuroscience is absolutely awe-inspiring. I speak now supporting neuroscience as opposed to neuroscientism. I mean, what has happened in the last 100 years has been absolutely amazing, our understanding the brain. So there is a glamour of neuroscience, an appropriate glamour. But secondly, there is the belief, a false belief, that if we don't subscribe to a supernatural account of what we humans are, the only alternative is a naturalistic account. If we're not, as it were, descended from heaven, then we must be part of the biological world. I don't think that's the case. I think we are neither angels nor apes. We're something quite different. But there are those who feel if we're not angels, we must be apes.
And I think that's important to understand, that you're not critiquing Darwin, you're critiquing the misuse of Darwin's theories, so that we don't want to lead into some assumption that all of Darwin isn't useful, and therefore the only other option that we have is creationism, for example.
Oh, absolutely. And I would hate it to be thought in the Pacific that I was a creationist nutter or subscribed to intelligent design. I think that both of those ideas are utterly empty. I'm a good Darwinian, but I don't have Darwinitis, which is obviously the inflamed state of Darwinism. Biological explanations of human behavior are attractive, is that it lets us off the hook. If my brain made me do it, if the shaping of my brain in the Pleistocene era explains my behavior, and so on and so forth, then really I can't be held responsible. So it sort of gets rid of any kind of feeling of guilt and responsibility. And I think that's quite attractive. If, for example, I behave extraordinarily badly, but say it was my brain made me do it, if I managed to make a large pile of money, but through dubious practices, well, all I'm doing is exercising the right of my genes to be selfish. I'm trying to replicate my genetic material through the vehicle of my body and the vehicle of society, which is precisely the Darwinian mission that I have. It's not me being naughty or wrong or wicked.
Or I shouldn't feel responsible morally for privilege or my economic wealth because I feel like I'm just entitled because I'm a superior example of the species in the evolutionary struggle for the survival of the fittest.
You're absolutely right. You know, the masters of the universe are just the descendants of the alpha gorillas, as it were. They turned out to be masters of nothing, of course, and they certainly had required a lot of bailing out. But that was the feeling. I mean, the most well-known example, use of Darwinitis long before it became popular, was in Wall Street, wasn't it? Greed is good. You know, it drives us forward. Humanity will go higher and higher through the operation of greed, which will ensure that the fittest will survive. Utterly repulsive and actually very, very deeply inconsistent and hypocritical.
Something you wrote, Ray, really struck me. You said that a materialist understanding of consciousness makes more and more sense the more damaged the brain is. And I'm wondering whether you think that there might be some implications for the excitement and interest in neuroscience and the interest in evolutionary explanations of human experience and motivation. If there might be some interest in that in terms of control and the idea of just if you can just reduce people to machines, then you have a sense of being able to basically have a much more simplistic model for modeling and controlling human behavior.
I think there's two very interesting things in what you said. I'm dealing with the second one first. There is the hope that it's been discussed in the UK that we should get beyond the politics of right and left. We should think about the politics of the right and left hemisphere. And politicians should develop policies, social policies, that go with the grain of the brain. And ultimately, a good politician would be a kind of neural shepherd of the sheep. That addresses the second part of what you said. But the first part is that it is true that the more brain damaged we are, the more perhaps some of what we do can be explained in terms of brain damage. I'm thinking, for example, I did epilepsy clinics for 20 years, and when my patients were having epileptic fits, in the moment of having epileptic fits, you could understand what was happening, their twitching and their loss of consciousness, entirely and solely in brain activity. It didn't belong to their biography, except as far as it upset them. But when they came round and they listened to my advice or didn't take my advice and decided whether they should or shouldn't tell their employer about it, they decided not to drive or to drive their car and so on and so forth, they, as it were, coped with epilepsy, then you could no longer explain their behavior in simple neurological terms. In other words, the epileptic fit, as an expression of brain damage, could have a largely neurological explanation, but how the person who had epilepsy dealt with it, that wouldn't be amenable to any kind of imaginable neurological explanation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about, for example, of hunger. Hunger, we can say, is a very simple biological mechanism, but it's not when you consider that different people respond to their hunger in different ways, and some people may actually induce hunger as a form of fasting, or may have a completely different interpretation of the experience in a more positive light. So we never ever escape the fact that there's a conscious human being that is ultimately deciding what the meaning is of these experiences, even if they are thoroughly biological experiences themselves.
I think hunger is a brilliant example of how we always transform the biological givens. In fact, I wrote a book called Hunger from 2 or 3 years ago, which has looked at the transformations of hunger. And even in situations where you think that people will be reduced to hungry beasts, their behavior was different depending on their background, the person they were, and so on and so forth. And I dwelt quite a lot on hunger in concentration camps, where people were hungry all the time. And yet, if you look at people's behavior, they were not reduced just to hungry beasts. Many people in that situation behaved extraordinarily well. And then there's the way we transform our hunger. You know, at the one level, we take the pleasure that comes with eating food and elaborate it to an extraordinary degree in gourmet food and so on and so forth. We have a hunger for pleasure. We then have in human beings a different sort of hunger which can overcome the biological one, which is a hunger for recognition by others, the need to be loved, the need to be desired, the need to be wanted and approved of. And then finally, there's something that has absolutely no biological correlate at all, which is a spiritual hunger, a hunger for meaning, which is something you were referring to earlier.
I think that's a really good example from the Holocaust, and of course it brings to mind Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, that even in the most extreme conditions where we would think that someone would be reduced to an animal or would just be a function of their biological necessities and the pain and the suffering that they're going through, still, even in that context, there's fundamentally meaning-making by humans. It's about values, it's about our personalities, it's about our learning, it's about how we make meaning out of that situation, that we cannot simply ever be reduced to what we are as physical organisms.
For me, the key document is Primo Levi's If This Be a Man. I think in America it's translated as Survival in Auschwitz. But he talks about a time when, again, he was hungry, he was facing violence all the time, he was in an appalling situation of grueling work, and he never knew when he might be just shot at random for some frivolous reason. And yet he got incredibly frantic about the fact there was a particular passage of Dante's Inferno which he wanted to share with a fellow Italian, and he couldn't remember those lines, and he was quite preoccupied by it. And I just thought, wow, that's what a human being is. And there's no biological content to trying to remember it, or no biological purpose in trying to remember, 3 lines from Dante.
So even if we do have biologically driven suffering, that doesn't explain the whole picture of who we are as a person. And Ray, a lot of what you're saying reminds me of a lot of the critique of behaviorism and the reduction of the individual to not having any consciousness at all, but just being a response to stimulus of positive and negative reinforcement. And that's, I think, in a similar way, it's a misunderstanding of what we are as human beings. But I also want to say that somehow, and this gets back to the question I was asking before, it is a useful misunderstanding that unfortunately, if you treat people like stimulus response black boxes, you can actually get pretty far in terms of controlling people. And so I'm wondering, what are the implications of neuromania and Darwinitis in terms of the use that these are going to be put to in terms of things like understanding human behavior, controlling people with medications, or seeing things in biological terms, or just framing things purely in terms of competition and those kinds of biological evolutionary understandings. Is there some usefulness to this, and does that partly explain why there's so much interest in it?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. There seem to be 2 consequences. There is a minor consequence that this kind of thinking about us gets in the way of our really thinking about us, about ourselves. Neuromania and Darwinitis are a pest because they, as John Locke would say, they're rubbish on the path to truth. But there is a much more sinister implication, which is that you deny the fundamental dignity of human beings as conscious agents. That there's an input and an output, and they're just sort of pathways within the causal network. That's what the behaviorist point of view was. And of course, current neuromania is more subtle. It allows more intermediate steps. But ultimately, if your mind is your brain, and your brain, as it surely is an evolved organ, then you're going to follow a biological prescription. If what's more, your brain is a material object, as it certainly is, then you're going to be wired in to the material world. You're just part of a causal network. And so you can see how this kind of view, if taken seriously, actually would utterly undermine the dignity of individuals as conscious agents. And of course, we've seen what has happened in the past when human beings are not treated as conscious agents, but as basically are under the influence of unconscious forces. If you think of the historical unconscious that was invoked in Marxism, and one saw how people were treated in the Soviet Union because they were not regarded as individuals whose views should be taken seriously. They were merely expressions of class interests or a particular phase of society and so on and so forth. There's a deep contradiction in all that, because if we really were unconscious in this way, if we really were merely input-output mechanisms, how would we have ever discovered it?
It's interesting. So the idea of impersonal human forces is kind of like the idea of evolutionary necessity, or like the idea of neurons firing in the brain. It's basically a taking away of the central importance of free will to the equation. So it seems like a lot of your discussion comes back to this whole question of free will, because evolutionary psychology and the neuroscience explanations of human motivation want to, in a sense, get us away from the idea that we are free actors and that we have choices and we have the capacity to engage in free will. Can you say a little bit about that aspect of your work?
In 1997, I published a book called Enemies of Hope, a great, long, fat book, I hasten to say. I think I mentioned the fact that Lenin's Greatest Act of Oppression was his collected works, and I'm afraid mine are rather lengthy, where I looked at the critique of the conscious agent and the denial of the centrality of the conscious agent of a person, as the Enlightened would say, as an independent point of departure. I looked at the historical unconscious, the linguistic unconscious of those who subscribe to theory, the Freudian unconscious of those who said, we were in the grip of unconscious forces, different forms of unconscious. And all of these, I saw them as enemies of hope, because they deny individuals that individuals are independent points of departure. Of course, I am not a blank sheet. I am not an agent without a context, or an agent without any kind of influences, but I still am an agent. And I don't believe that those individuals who question our agency are really sincere. They somehow think that they themselves are acting as free individuals. So when a scientist discovers somehow that we're in the grip of our brain, he doesn't think his act of discovering that is merely another manifestation of brain activity. He thinks he transcends the brain and can see what the brain's up to.
And that's one of the logical fallacies of a lot of the neuroscience explanations of consciousness.
But it's interesting, I'm having a very pleasant dialogue with David Eagleman at the moment. It's going to be published in The Observer, which is an English newspaper, next week, about his book called Incognito, in which he says essentially consciousness plays a very small part in our life, and that the brain is calling the shots, and so on and so forth. And I'll keep on saying to David, how did you know that? How did you know that you're unconscious, etc., etc.? And he appeals to all sorts of situations like that we often are mistaken as to the nature of the things we see. Yes, there are illusions, but if everything was an illusion, how would we know that anything was an illusion? There is this self-contradiction. I mean, if we really were all prisoned in the intracranial darkness, there would be no brain science. Brain science is forged in the community of minds.
So it's clear that a lot of brain activity happens outside of conscious awareness, just like our liver and our spleen and our stomach are doing all kinds of things behind the scenes.
Exactly. Just when I walk to the pub, I don't actually make the cross bridges form and unform in the muscles of my thigh. Just need to say that I'm not walking to the pub as a conscious agent. I'm so glad you picked up on that, because that's something I feel exasperated about. You probably recognize in my rising tonal envelope. You can see it straight away, and I can't understand why these characters can't.
Because they claim that, well, because of so many things are happening unconsciously, then there must not be consciousness at all, actually, is kind of what they're saying.
Well, in this conversation, I have absolutely no idea how my larynx has formed the words that I've used doesn't mean to say that I'm not actually conscious of what I'm doing or deliberately formulating ideas that I hope will correspond to a meaning that I mean.
Let's address this question, Ray, because you've been critiquing the idea that the brain is the mind and that actually that we can't just simply explain mental activity and consciousness as a result of neurons firing in the brain. But you've also said that, the brain is sort of a necessary component of mind. We're dependent on the brain just in the sense that if you wanted to listen to Mozart, you need to, not being in Mozart's presence, which we can't do, but you have to rely on a radio or a stereo or something like that, but it's not really the essence of what Mozart is. Well, what is your guess or what is your understanding or theory at this point of how we explain this experience that we're all so familiar with and yet it's so mysterious of being conscious and being aware and having a mind?
I don't think I have an explanation, but I'm confident nobody else does either. So I have the Socratic wisdom of being aware of my lack of knowledge. I mean, it seems to me that there is a really interesting job to be done. If we don't think that mind is identical with that particular configuration of matter called the brain, then we've got to ask questions about what is the place of the mind in the universe. How is it that, for example, a pebble, which is, I think, thoughtless, and myself, whom I think thinks, how did we come to be so different? What is it about me that makes me different from a pebble, or indeed from a tree, or indeed from an ape? And I don't think we'll start asking those questions so long as we think they've been solved by saying, oh, the difference is something called the brain, and that's more complex than the brain of a chimp, or more complex than a pebble. I think we haven't even started asking these questions. One of my favorite writers is Gertrude Stein, and on her deathbed she said, one of my favorite authors is Gertrude Stein, and on her deathbed she said, what is the answer? There was no response. So she said, okay, what's the question? And I think we haven't even started formulating those questions that will enable us to understand the place of the mind in a largely mindless universe.
And I think one of the implications here, too, is that if we stay with the mystery, if we really acknowledge what we don't know and we have a certain humility before what it is to be aware and be conscious and have a mind and be a human being, that I think leads to more humane, caring, and compassionate treatment of each other. Would you agree?
I would agree with you entirely. If you see someone has a mental illness as just a brain that's gone wrong, you're already treating them as an object in a sense. And if you treat some of one's fellows as just their brains, that you're treating them as an object. You're, as it were, withholding the genuine thou from them. This doesn't actually happen in real life. I'm sure a lot of these neuromaniac folk are incredibly generous in their personal life, but that's totally at odds with the world picture to which they seem or claim to subscribe.
And Ray, we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some promising directions for research in consciousness that you do think might be more illuminating rather than misleading?
Well, the first thing is people are starting to look outside the brain. They're talking about the embodied mind. So suddenly the body has been discovered. Yippee. And people have also started discovering what they call the extended mind, and Andy Clark and so on have referred to supersizing the mind, and that starts to incorporate the environment in which a human being lives and has their being. And that acknowledges at least that consciousness is a relational thing. It's about our relationship to a body, to an environment, to others. And you can't take one of those relata away without getting rid of consciousness. One of the areas that I think is not fruitful is to look to quantum mechanics or quantum physics as a way forward for understanding the nature of mind. And there's a simple reason for this, is that quantum mechanics and quantum physics applies equally to pebbles that have no minds and to people like you and me who have minds. And it's because physics has such a general application to the material world, I don't think even in its quantum form it can help us to understand the relationship between mind and body, or the place of the mind in the universe.
Ray, we don't have much time left in the interview. Can you just remind us the names of your recent books and how people can get in touch with you if they want more information about your work?
Oh, thank you. Well, I have a website, which is www.raymondtallis.com. And the most recent, you've mentioned Aping Mankind, which brings together a lot of my preoccupations about biologism. In Defense of Wonder, which has just come out today, is really an attempt to show the place of philosophy in our understanding of the world. and enriching our understanding of the world. A philosophy that's not on the one hand guru, or on the other hand 1,000 dusty footnotes, chased down a labyrinth of various responses. So that's the most recent book. I'm working currently on a trilogy which begins with time. It's called Of Time and Lamentation, and its primary aim is to extract time from the jaws of physics and to look at the mystery of time as it is experienced by human beings. It's part of a trilogy because the second volume, which has started to come together, is called Logos, which is about the mystery of the fact that the world makes sense to us. And the climactic part of the trilogy is called De Luce, or Concerning the Light, which is just a meditation on the fact that we are conscious in an illuminated world.
Raymond Tallis, thank you for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Oh, well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much indeed.
You've been listening to an interview with Dr. Raymond Tallis. He's a clinical neuroscientist and physician of gerontology who was named by The Economist magazine as one of the world's top living polymaths and named by Prospect magazine as one of Britain's top 100 intellectuals. He's a poet, novelist, and a short story writer, and his recent books are Michelangelo's Finger, The Kingdom of Infinite Space, and most recently, Aping Mankind, Neuromania, Darwinitis, and the Misrepresentation of Humanity. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health, co-sponsored by the Icarus Project, Portland Hearing Voices, and Freedom Center. Madness Radio is hosted by Will Hall, and producer is Leah Harris. Madness Radio is based at KBOO in Oregon and can be heard on FM stations on the Pacifica Radio Network. Listen on the internet at madnessradio.net and on iTunes. Contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.